The nation froze. Phones buzzed in pockets from London to Edinburgh, and news anchors across the globe cut off mid-sentence, their faces draining of color as the red, breaking news ticker began to scroll. This wasn't just a routine health update or another vague palace communique wrapped in diplomatic fog. In a move that shattered centuries of royal silence, King Charles III stepped forward, not as a distant sovereign shrouded in the mystique of the throne, but as a man forced to admit that even a king can bleed. This was the moment the palace machine reached its breaking point. For months, the House of Windsor had leaned on its oldest weapon, silence. They told us to respect their privacy. They told us everything is fine, while the inner machinery was spinning into a frantic, desperate overdrive. But today, the mask didn't just slip. It fell away entirely, leaving the world to stare at the raw, unfiltered reality of a monarchy in crisis. Charles stood at the podium in a quiet corner of Buckingham Palace, his voice barely masking the emotional storm beneath. There were no aides flanking him to soften the blow, no carefully edited scripts to hide the truth. Just a king and his conscience, finally admitting that the heartbreaking decision he had made was no longer a private burden. It was a constitutional earthquake. "I can no longer remain silent," he began, his eyes revealing a man who had been holding too much for too long. It was a direct rejection of the golden rule, never explain, never complain. With those few words, the ironclad protocol that had protected the throne for generations didn't just crack. It dissolved. The decision Charles revealed wasn't just personal. It was a manifesto for a future that many fear might never come. He didn't speak like a man hoping to start a conversation. He spoke like a man declaring war on the very secrecy that had protected him his entire life. As he laid out the terms of this new reality, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to a heavy, suffocating shock. The fairy tale monarchy was dead, replaced by something far more human, far more fragile, and infinitely more dangerous to the status quo. People began to speculate instantly. Was he stepping away? Was the crown too heavy for a man facing his own mortality? The speculation didn't just light up social media. It sent shockwaves through the halls of Parliament and Whitehall, where officials were told to remain available for briefings that no one had truly prepared for. As Charles looked the cameras dead on, he wasn't the polished figure the institution had spent decades shaping. He was a leader forced to choose between the preservation of an ancient script and the survival of his own family. And in that choice, he has reset the rules of the game forever. The announcement by King Charles was no spontaneous outburst of emotion. It was the calculated, agonizing response to a meltdown that had been brewing long before the world heard his trembling voice. While the public was fed an illusion of calm, the internal machinery of the monarchy was spinning into a frantic, desperate overdrive. This was no longer about preserving the dignity of the throne. It was a cold-blooded war for the survival of trust itself. The first warning signs didn't come from a press release. They came quietly from the mist-covered grounds of Balmoral and Sandringham. These serene symbols of royal tradition had suddenly become hotbeds of clandestine activity. Private helicopters landing in the dead of night, unmarked cars slipping through side gates, and a flurry of visits by senior royals who were supposed to be miles away. Something was deeply wrong, and the palace was fighting a losing battle to keep the lid on it. The most chilling signal came at 12 minutes past midnight. An emergency physician, one of the royal household's most discreet medical figures, was spotted entering Clarence House. No cameras were invited. No announcement followed. But to those who understand the patterns of palace behavior, this was a silent scream. Medical visits at that hour do not happen for minor ailments. They happen when the stakes are catastrophic or deeply confidential. It was a red flag that the king's health was no longer a private matter, but a national emergency. Inside the palace, a fierce battle erupted between the king and the machine, the shadow government of advisors and lawyers who have controlled the royal narrative for decades. These advisors, obsessed with the never complain, never explain mantra, pushed for more secrecy. They wanted to use the privacy shield to delay the truth, to keep the public in the dark while they managed the reputational fallout. They pressured Charles to continue the charade, to wave from a distance and smile for the cameras while the foundations were crumbling. But Charles, perhaps for the first time in his reign, chose the truth over the tradition. Sources close to the king say he hit the desk in a rare moment of fury, declaring, "No more hiding." When a man who has lived by protocol for 70 years decides to burn the rulebook, it means the situation has moved beyond the reach of public relations. The palace, famous for its Stonewall silence, was forced into a state of active defense. They weren't just managing news. They were trying to stop a tidal wave of reality from drowning the monarchy. The silence that followed the king's initial words was heavy, but it was the detail of the medical revelation that truly sent the world into a tailspin. For months, the palace had used vague terms like scheduled procedure and recuperation. They treated the king's health like a minor engine stall in a vintage Bentley. But as Charles stood before the nation, the metaphors changed. He spoke of a body that was no longer responding to the traditional oiling of royal medicine. He wasn't just a patient. He was a sovereign realizing that his time as an active ruler was being forcibly shortened by a reality no title could override. Behind the scenes, the clinical truth was far more grim than any tabloid had dared to print. Insider reports, whispered by those who saw the private charts, spoke of a condition that had progressed with terrifying speed. We are talking about a systemic failure that the palace had fought to suppress with every legal and PR weapon in their arsenal. While the public saw a king waving from a limousine, the reality was a man struggling through agonizing treatments that left him a shadow of his former self. The heartbreaking decision wasn't just about his health. It was about the admission that the crown's duty of constant presence was now a physical impossibility. But the real earthquake came when Charles hinted at the hidden pact he had made with his heir, Prince William. This wasn't a formal constitutional amendment discussed in Parliament. This was a father-son agreement born in the quiet of Highgrove, away from the prying eyes of the palace machine. Sources suggest that weeks before this announcement, William had been summoned to a private meeting. No aides, no secretaries, just the two men who hold the weight of the future. It was here that Charles reportedly delivered the ultimatum to himself. He would not become a shadow king, clinging to power while the institution withered. The pact involves a radical, unofficial handover of power, a regency in all but name. William, normally the image of stoic composure, was seen leaving that meeting with a face that betrayed a profound burden. He wasn't just preparing to be king. He was being asked to shield his father's final days from the very system they both serve. This pact is a direct challenge to the old guard of the palace, who believe a king must rule until his last breath. Charles and William have essentially redrawn the line of succession in the dark, choosing the survival of the family over the archaic rules of the institution. As the king reached this part of his disclosure, the weight of the betrayal by the system became clear. He wasn't just fighting an illness. He was fighting a hierarchy that demanded he stay quiet while his world, and Catherine's world, was crumbling. The heartbreak in his voice wasn't for the loss of power, but for the realization that the crown had almost cost him his humanity. But the most haunting layer of King Charles's decision isn't found in his own medical charts or the constitutional documents on his desk. It is etched into the weary, yet elegant face of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She is the brightest jewel in the royal crown, the future queen who has been the monarchy's greatest asset. Yet, beneath the polished appearances and the headlines praising her stoicism, Catherine was quietly fighting a private war that the palace machine tried desperately to bury. In his revelation, Charles finally pulled back the curtain on a truth that has left the nation in a state of collective heartbreak. The institution was breaking her, and he refused to let it finish the job. The king's voice shook as he spoke about the pressure placed on his daughter-in-law. For months, while the public was told she was in remission and returning to duties, the reality inside the palace walls was a landscape of exhaustion and forced smiles. The monarchy, desperate to project an image of stability while the king was sidelined, had leaned far too heavily on Catherine. They demanded photo ops while she was still grappling with the brutal aftereffects of treatment. They pushed for grace under pressure when what she needed was the grace of silence and time. Charles admitted that seeing Catherine's struggle was the final catalyst for his decision. He spoke of the guilt that has haunted him, the guilt of a father watching history repeat itself. He looked at Catherine and saw the echoes of Diana, another woman who was expected to smile for the cameras, while her world was crumbling behind closed doors. But where the palace of the past demanded sacrifice, Charles has chosen protection. He confirmed that a significant part of his heartbreaking decision involves a complete withdrawal of Catherine from the traditional royal performance. This is a radical departure from centuries of protocol. The old guard of the palace argued that the princess must be seen to be believed, that the public would lose faith if she remained hidden. But Charles's counter-argument was devastatingly simple. A crown is not worth the life of a mother. He has effectively neutralized the palace machine's power over her schedule, placing her health and her role as a mother to George, Charlotte, and Louis above the demands of the state. As this part of the announcement filtered out, the image of Catherine deteriorating fast under the strain became a vivid, painful reality for the audience. William's role in this pact became even clearer. He is not just an heir taking over for a sick father. He is a husband standing as a human shield between his wife and the institution that nearly consumed his mother. The king's revelation wasn't just about a change in the monarchy. It was a public declaration that the human beings wearing the crowns will no longer be sacrificed at the altar of appearances. The shockwaves from this are profound. By prioritizing Catherine's humanity over her royal duty, Charles has fundamentally altered the contract between the royals and the public. He is telling the world that the perfect princess was a facade maintained at a catastrophic cost. And as the world listens, the question isn't just about when she will return, but whether the monarchy can survive a future where its brightest star is no longer willing to burn herself out for the sake of the flame. While the bells of London tolled with the weight of Charles's announcement, 6,000 miles away, in the manicured silence of Montecito, the news hit like a physical blow. For Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, this heartbreaking decision by his father was more than just a royal update. It was the final, devastating confirmation of his own displacement. What Harry realized in real time, along with the rest of the world, was that even in the face of a constitutional earthquake, he was no longer a part of the fortress. He was a spectator to his own family's collapse. The new compact forged between Charles and William, that secret handover of power and the protection of Catherine, had been designed, finalized, and broadcast without a single consultation with the man once known as the Spare. The psychological impact of this exclusion is impossible to overstate. For years, Harry has warned about the machine, the cold, institutional system that prioritizes the crown over the individual. Now, in a twist of tragic irony, his father was publicly admitting that Harry was right. Charles was finally choosing family over protocol and humanity over the old guard. But, and this is the jagged edge of the betrayal, Charles was doing it only for those who stayed within the palace walls. The king was reforming the monarchy for William and Catherine, while leaving Harry in the cold of his self-imposed exile. Reports from sources close to the Sussexes suggest that Harry didn't receive a personal briefing or a warm phone call before the cameras rolled. He found out the same way you did, through a screen watching his father's voice tremble. This wasn't just a lapse in communication. It was a deliberate signal from the palace. By excluding Harry from the heartbreaking decision, the institution was effectively saying that the rift is no longer just a family dispute. It is now a structural reality of the British state. But there is a deeper, more chilling detail buried in Harry's reaction. Notice the deafening silence regarding Meghan. In the immediate aftermath, as Harry struggled to find his footing, her name was conspicuously absent from the narrative. Insiders whisper that this decision has forced a reckoning within the Sussex household. Harry is now caught in a brutal pincer movement of the heart. The realization that while he fought to protect his wife from the institution has now moved on and evolved into something he no longer recognizes, and something he is no longer invited to lead. The king's announcement has turned Harry's truth into yesterday's news. Harry spent years being the rebel, the one crying out for change. But now that the change is actually happening, it is being led by the very brother he has spent years at war with. The realization that William is now the human shield for Catherine, a role Harry once prided himself on, is a bitter pill that no amount of California sunshine can sweeten. As the world watches the fallout, the question is no longer about a reunion. It is about whether Harry can survive the psychological weight of being the only one left out of the monarchy's new, vulnerable reality. Charles has redrawn the map of the House of Windsor, and for the first time in history, the border has been permanently closed to the son who left. As the aftershocks of King Charles's decision continued to shake the very foundations of the monarchy, a ghost from the past suddenly reappeared, more powerful and more chilling than ever before. This is the moment the narrative takes a dark, prophetic turn. The revelation of Princess Diana's long-suppressed private documents. Charles disclosed that during his most vulnerable hours, while confronting his own mortality, he uncovered a sealed file hidden deep within the private royal archives. A document that the palace machine had deliberately buried for nearly 3 decades. Picture the heavy, suffocating silence of the private study at Highgrove, where a weary king touched the yellowed pages bearing Diana's unmistakable, decisive handwriting. She had written of a future she saw as early as the mid-90s. A monarchy collapsing not from external attacks, but from a withering from within. Diana warned of a pain loop, a cycle where heirs are crushed into a soulless mold until they no longer recognize the face staring back at them in the mirror. Charles confessed that reading those words was like a death blow to his conscience. Diana had predicted with surgical precision exactly what is happening to Catherine today. The physical and mental erosion under the weight of fake perfection. She also wrote of Harry's rebellion, describing it not as a betrayal, but as the cry of a neglected soul, drowning in institutional indifference. Suddenly, every tragic piece of Charles's life fell into place. He realized he wasn't the leader of a great institution. He was its most loyal prisoner, guarding the very gates of the system that was eating his own children alive. The heartbreaking decision Charles announced is, in truth, an act of desperate atonement. He admitted that he was too late to save Diana from the coldness of the crown, but he refused to let history repeat itself with Catherine. He declared a major surgery on royal protocol, vowing to strip away the toxic secrecy that has poisoned his family for generations. Diana once wrote, "The truth will set us free, but first, it will make us miserable." Charles is now embracing that misery before the entire world, trading the crown's mystique for the lives of those he loves. But the most terrifying secret lay on the final page of the manuscript. Diana mentioned shadow forces within the palace, the keepers of tradition who held the keys to the kingdom's secrets. She claimed they always knew the health risks the family faced but chose to enforce silence to maintain the illusion of power. Charles realized his enemy wasn't just the illness ravaging his body, but the shadows lurking behind the velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace. This is no longer a medical update. It is a purge of a legacy. It is a war to reclaim the human within the House of Windsor before the throne collapses into the dust of its own secrets. The silence that followed King Charles's revelation of Diana's prophecy was not one of respect. It was the silence of a predator preparing to strike. While the public wept for a broken king, the men in gray suits, the high-ranking courtiers and constitutional advisors who truly run the palace, were moving into the shadows to execute a counteroffensive. For these guardians of tradition, Charles hadn't just shared a personal truth. He had committed the ultimate royal sin. He had pulled back the curtain on the mystique that keeps the monarchy alive. In their eyes, an honest king is a dangerous king, and a dangerous king must be neutralized. Behind the closed doors of the Privy Council chambers, a constitutional coup began to take shape. Insiders reveal that hours after the king's announcement, a secret meeting was convened without his knowledge. The topic? Section 4 of the Regency Act. The advisors began to whisper a terrifying word: incapacity. They weren't just talking about his physical illness. They were weaponizing his emotional vulnerability. They argued that his obsession with Diana's letters and his radical desire for transparency were proof that the strain of the crown, and his cancer, had unseated his judgment. They wanted to declare him unfit to rule, not because he couldn't perform his duties, but because he was performing them with too much truth. The tension reached a boiling point when the king was confronted in his private apartments. Imagine the scene. A man weakened by treatment, sitting in the very chair where his mother once sat, facing a wall of cold, unblinking bureaucrats telling him that his honesty was destabilizing the state. They pressured him to walk back his statements, to blame the Diana prophecy on a moment of emotional fever, and to return to the shadows of the old guard. They threatened him with a forced abdication that would be framed as a medical necessity, effectively stripping him of his voice before he could finish what he started. But what these advisors underestimated was the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose. Charles's response was a masterclass in defiance. He reminded them that while they serve the crown, he is the crown. He made it clear that any attempt to remove him would result in a public trial of the institution itself. He wasn't just fighting for his reign. He was fighting for the right of the monarchy to have a soul. The heartbreaking decision was now a declaration of independence from the very machine that had managed his life for 75 years. As the news of this internal civil war began to leak, the public's perception of the palace shifted from reverence to suspicion. People began to ask, who really runs the United Kingdom? Is it the king we see on the screen, or the shadows lurking in the hallways of Buckingham Palace? The battle lines are now drawn. On one side stands a king determined to burn the old script to save his family. On the other, a system determined to save the script even if it means destroying the king. The institution is no longer at war with the modern world. It is at war with itself. As the men in gray suits moved to isolate King Charles, they turned their sights toward the one person they believed they could still control, Prince William. In their calculated view, William was the safe choice, the heir who had spent his entire life being the perfect pupil of protocol. They approached him with a chilling proposition. Side with the council, help them frame the king's heartbreaking decision as a medical lapse, and accelerate his own path to the throne. They offered him the crown on a silver platter, provided he helped them bury his father's truth. But what the advisors failed to realize was that they were no longer talking to the compliant boy of the past. They were talking to a man who had watched the system nearly destroy every woman he ever loved. Behind the scenes, William's response was not a discussion. It was an ultimatum that has left the palace hierarchy in a state of absolute paralysis. According to high-level insiders, William met with the constitutional advisors in a room filled with the heavy portraits of his ancestors, and he delivered a message that effectively ended the old guard's influence. He made it clear, if you move against my father, you lose the future. He informed them that if they attempted to declare the king incapacitated to protect the mystique of the monarchy, he would refuse the regency. He would walk away, taking Catherine and the children with him, leaving the throne empty and the institution in total collapse. This was the moment the institution truly felt the cold breath of extinction. For the first time in 1,000 years, the heir to the throne was using his own succession as a weapon against the state. William wasn't just defending his father. He was protecting the new compact they had forged in the shadows of Catherine's illness. He realized that if he allowed the palace to silence Charles now, they would surely silence him and Catherine later. By standing with his father, William has chosen blood over the institution and humanity over the gray suits. He has turned the Spares rebellion into an heirs revolution. The atmosphere inside Kensington Palace has shifted to one of active resistance. William has reportedly taken control of the king's personal security and communications, cutting off the traditional channels that the advisors used to manipulate the narrative. He is now the human shield he promised to be, standing between a weakened king and a predatory system. This ultimatum has created a constitutional stalemate. The advisors cannot remove the king without the heir's cooperation, and the heir is now their fiercest opponent. As the public begins to sense this shift in power, the image of William has been transformed. He is no longer just the stoic prince waiting for his turn. He is the commander of a new kind of monarchy, one that is defined by loyalty to people, not to paper protocols. The heartbreaking decision was the spark, but William's ultimatum is the fire that is burning down the old way of doing business. The palace machine, once thought to be invincible, is now staring at a future where it no longer holds the remote control to the royal family's lives. As the stalemate between the king and the men in gray suits continued behind closed doors, a far more powerful force began to wake up: the global public. For decades, the world had consumed the British monarchy as a beautifully produced stage play, a series of curated smiles, rigid parades, and vague health updates that always promised business as usual. But the king's heartbreaking decision and William's fierce ultimatum didn't just break the palace rules. They shattered the mirage. Suddenly, millions of people from London to New York realized they had been participants in a massive institutional lie. The realization hit like a tidal wave. We weren't just watching a monarchy. We were watching the slow, systematic dehydration of human souls in the name of tradition. The public's reckoning was immediate and visceral. On social media, in the streets, and across dinner tables of the 50 to 80-year-old generation, those who had respected the institution for a lifetime, the tone shifted from reverence to a raw, burning indignation. The common question was no longer, when will the king return? But what have they done to him? People began to see the king's frailty not as a weakness of the crown, but as a searing indictment of the machine that demanded he perform until his last breath. The images of Catherine's forced smiles during her secret battle were now reviewed through a lens of collective guilt. The public realized they had been silent accomplices in her exhaustion, and the anger was now directed squarely at the bureaucrats who had managed the deception. This reckoning created a human wall of support around Charles and William. In an unprecedented move, global sentiment turned against the palace's old guard. Petitions began to circulate not for lower taxes or political change, but for the right to be human. The people were effectively saying to the courtiers, "Let him be a father, let her be a mother, let the king be a man." By choosing transparency over secrecy, Charles had accidentally triggered the greatest democratic defense of the monarchy in history. The public wasn't revolting against the king. They were revolting for him, against the system that held him hostage. The moral weight of this moment has fundamentally changed the social contract between the ruler and the ruled. For centuries, the public accepted the royals' privilege in exchange for their mystery. But Charles's decision has revealed that the mystery was often just a mask for suffering. The audience, especially the older generation who value family legacy and the truth of a life well lived, is now demanding a new monarchy. They want an institution that is accountable, not just for its finances, but for its humanity. They are choosing the king's vulnerability over the palace's perfection. As the world stands on the brink of the final revelation, the palace advisors find themselves isolated. They no longer have the public's blind loyalty to hide behind. The heartbreaking decision has educated the masses. They now recognize the signs of institutional suppression. They see the gray suits as the villains of the story, and the king as the tragic hero who finally found his voice. The mirage of the invincible institution has collapsed, leaving behind something far more fragile, but infinitely more valuable: the truth. The monarchy is no longer a symbol of power. It has become a symbol of the struggle to remain human in a world that wants us to be machines. The heartbreaking decision has finally been codified. As the sun set over the towering spires of Windsor, King Charles III did what no monarch before him dared. He signed a charter of humanity into the royal archives. This wasn't a document of power, but a document of surrender, a formal admission that the machine had lost its grip on the House of Windsor. The decision to prioritize Catherine's health, to embrace William's revolution, and to honor Diana's prophecy has changed the monarchy forever. It is no longer an invincible fortress built on secrecy. It is a family, fragile and honest, leading a nation not from a pedestal, but from the heart. But as the king sat back, his pen resting on the desk once used by his mother, the true cost of this legacy became clear. The monarchy has been saved, but the old world is dead. By choosing the truth, Charles has effectively ended the mystique that protected the royals for 1,000 years. He has traded the crown's divine right for the public's human empathy. The heartbreaking reality is that Charles will likely be remembered as the transition king, the man who had to break the institution to save his children from it. He has laid the foundation for a future he may never see, ensuring that when William eventually ascends, he will do so as a man, not a puppet of the gray suits. Catherine remains the quiet architect of this new era. Her battle with cancer and the palace's initial deception became the catalyst for a global movement. She is no longer just a fashion icon or a poised princess. She is the symbol of a monarchy that finally learned to value life over legacy. William, standing by his father's side, is no longer the dutiful pupil. He is the guardian of a new, transparent House of Windsor. Together, they have proven that a monarchy that serves must first be seen in its most vulnerable state. They have traded their masks for their souls. As we look at the empty corridors of Buckingham Palace, once filled with the whispers of bureaucrats, we realize that the heartbreaking decision was actually a gift of freedom. The institution tried to remove the king for telling the truth, but the king ended up removing the institution's power over his family. The stalemate has ended in a victory for the human spirit. The House of Windsor has survived its greatest crisis, but it has emerged unrecognizable, leaner, more honest, and more connected to the struggles of everyday people than ever before. The ultimate question now rests with you, the viewer. As the lights go down on this royal reckoning, do you believe the monarchy can truly survive without its secrets? Has Charles's honesty rebuilt your trust? Or has it revealed a system that is too broken to ever truly heal? The heartbreaking decision has changed everything, but the final verdict belongs to history. One thing is certain, the bells of London are ringing for a new kind of king, a new kind of princess, and a truth that can never be buried again.